When I was a teenager, I became really interested in music kind of all of a sudden. My parents made me start taking piano lessons when I was 12, I think. So got maybe slightly later of a start than some, earlier than others. But I had a great teacher who kind of told me, you might have gotten too late a start to become a concert pianist. And so you might want to look for something else. And I had already started to kind of improvise and compose some short piano pieces. And when I was in high school, I got really fascinated by Leonard Bernstein just as a figure. I remember watching recordings of his performances at Tanglewood, and something about his kind of musical life and his presence really made me think being a composer could be a really interesting thing to do. And so in high school, I was admitted at the Boston University Tanglewood Institute, came up to the Berkshires here for study then, and then it really took off from there. And I think being a composer is an amazing thing. It's an amazing privilege to be able to create music, share it with other people, to collaborate with great performing organizations. It's just a really incredible thing to get to make new pieces of music and share them with people. So it's a huge privilege. Yeah. So I first heard the Duruflé Requiem when I was an undergraduate at the Eastman School of Music, and I remember both loving and being very vexed by it, in part because if you've ever heard the Duruflé Requiem, you know that it ends on a kind of unusual sonority for its time, where it almost doesn't sound finished. And so when Noah Horn approached me and asked me to write a companion piece to the Duruflé Requiem, I mean, my brain just lit up. There are so many memorable moments in the Duruflé that can be played with, channeled, responded to, all of these things. And so it was just a really kind of special invitation to get to play with these materials, to respond to them, and to kind of interact with that particular piece from the past. Faces of the Past I took from the selections of poetry by Mercedes de Acosta that I set here. The book from which I took her texts is called Moods, which I didn't think was quite the right title, but especially because this is a piece that's meant to respond to a requiem, which is so much about our living people's interactions with the dead. It seemed like the right little bit of text to take out of Mercedes de Acosta's poems to use as a title. My connection to Noah Horn, it goes back several years. We worked together here at Williams College. Noah directed our choirs here, and that was when we came in the closest contact and where I really came to know him, not just as an incredible choral conductor, but also as an amazing organist, as a very skilled trumpet player. I don't know how widely he shares that information, as a great pianist, as a great singer. We kept missing each other through our schooling. I went to Yale, but wasn't quite there when he was there. So I knew of him reputationally, and then was really delighted to get to work with him here at Williams College before he came to the cantata singers. I love that the theme of the season is connections, in part because being asked to write a piece that responds to or interacts with an existing piece of music, that is already an expression of the idea of connecting across time. Also, I think the texts that I chose for this piece are all about connections across time. And Mercedes de Acosta is writing about memories of the past and connecting with the thinking and the writings of the past in her writings. And so that was a really special and interesting idea. And musically, as a composer, I love drawing these connections between pieces where I can, at times, connect a musical idea of mine to a musical idea of Duruflé's and try to activate that memory of the Duruflé Requiem in people who know it already or who've just heard it for the first time. So I chose to structure my composition in 7 movements, and there are a few reasons for that decision. I wanted for there to be enough movements to kind of match the general shape of the Duruflé Requiem, which is also in many movements. And also, I wanted each of Mercedes de Acosta's poems to kind of match a certain movement from the Duruflé, where, for example, where you might get the Dies Irae, that Day of Wrath, in the Duruflé, you get a poem all about storms from Mercedes de Acosta. So I wanted to kind of match that that overall shape of the piece by having multiple contrasting movements in my own piece. There was so much great text to work with in Acosta's original. I did have to leave a lot out, of course, but I loved the idea of having enough to create, in a way, a kind of secular response to Duruflé's sacred Requiem. One of the things I remember best about singing the Duruflé Requiem for the first time, which was in grad school for me, was singing the incredible and very beautiful counterpoint of the Kyrie movement in the Duruflé. And I wanted for my piece to have a corresponding movement full of really rich and luscious and beautiful counterpoint. And so in my setting of the piece, this comes, like in Duruflé's, in the second movement position. There's this very rich, very beautiful, and very tonal counterpoint section after a slightly less warm opening. So you can actually chart across all of the movements that same kind of structure. I mentioned earlier about loving the In Paradisum movement, that vexing last movement of the Duruflé. And in that, I wanted to echo that shape. And so I found this Mercedes de Acosta poem. It's actually how she ended her book of poetry, with a similar idea of paradise, where she walks out onto the beach and she stares up at the night sky and sees a star in the distance. And it just seemed perfect to match that kind of ethereal and mysterious mood of the In Paradisum from the Duruflé. So from movement to movement, hopefully you should be able to hear the connections to the Duruflé. Mercedes de Acosta's book of moods, the prose poems from which I took the text for this piece, begins with this amazing line, this very inviting line. I'm living tonight in a cloud of memory. And the ideas that immediately came to mind there were the exact kinds of whole tone inflected, very quiet and moody chords that you hear a bit in the Duruflé Requiem as well. And so I wanted to set the beginning all emerging from a single note, that note on the word I. I am living tonight in a cloud of memory. And these kinds of chords creating this inviting but mysterious feel at the very beginning of the piece, starting in a place of mystery that later finds a place of more self-assuredness and strength. The first moment in the Duruflé Requiem where there, to me, is a real kind of profession of faith and a strong profession of faith is the second movement, the Kyrie, that begins, Kyrie, very Gregorian chant inflected and very contrapuntal as the tenors then follow the basses. And so on. And in my piece, that first moment of strength in the text of Mercedes de Acosta comes in a poem that she titles Faith. And she writes, faith and hope are closely akin. And for that, I wanted to mimic that contrapuntal world, that very chant-influenced world of Duruflé. And so my melody, you'll hear, starts similarly with stepwise motion and starts again in the basses. This very chant-like inflection for the text, faith and hope, like this, to be chanted confidently after the first movement's mystery. The movements of my piece are very closely connected to the movements of Duruflé's piece, and you'll hear little motives that are shared across the two. Duruflé's Agnus Dei very memorably starts with this beautiful 16th note alteration in the harp that goes like this. Like this kind of fluttering motion. My sixth movement of my piece, called Revelation, uses a very similar motive at the very beginning in a very different key, but and as an entry point, they begin the same, but then Mercedes de Acosta's text takes us in a different direction than the text of the Agnus Dei. She writes, in the desperate moments of our lives when we are torn and spent, and so the mood turns darker. At the end of that movement, though, the mood turns back toward the hope of the Agnus Dei, and so there I channel the exact chord progression of of Duruflé. At one point he sets the word Requiem like this. And in my piece, the chord progression moves in different directions but lands with that same progression. So we'll hear for the text, and ask to see the star that may guide us. And ask to see the star that may guide us. So you hear just those last few chords are borrowed from the Duruflé, again, creating these connections across the two pieces. I think composers always have kind of secret inside games that they play in a given piece of music. And in my piece, I wanted to kind of hide references to the Duruflé, and there's probably no way that you would hear this in real time, but the opening of the Duruflé Requiem starts with this really beautiful, almost bubbling motif in the strings, this ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that kind of idea. And so I wanted to base the keys for each of the movements on that. And so the key of the first one is ba, and then the key of the second one is ba, and then the key of the third one, ba, and so on. So that opening idea in the Duruflé became a kind of hidden, maybe Easter egg organizing principle for me while I was working on the piece. So that's very, I would say, very nerdy, hidden stuff, but nonetheless, it's the kind of thing that I think for me helps me to feel like I have a plan while I'm working. If I were to open up my phone and launch Spotify and show you all my secrets, I'm not sure what would be right there. While I'm exercising, I love listening to mainstream pop. I listen a lot to Ariana Grande and other things like that. I am a huge fan of jazz and particularly of Nina Simone, and so I really love listening to Nina Simone while cooking or driving. We're also in my house, my husband and I are big Genesis fans. We like progressive kind of experimental rock of the 70s, 80s, and so that might also be hidden in there among other things. Because as a teacher at a college, I also use Spotify in the classroom, and so there's probably also a lot of music in there that I don't necessarily love listening to, but teach. And of course, a lot of classical music like the Duruflé and others.